The wind had teeth and a devil's voice. It screamed across the Arizona territory, a raw, scouring sound that peeled the skin from the land and sent sand spiraling into the bruised twilight. The grit was everywhere, in a man's mouth, in the folds of his clothes, in the chamber of his gun if he wasn't careful. Elias Boone was always careful. He lay on his bedroll, the canvas walls of his small tent shuddering around him, and listened to the storm try to tear his temporary world apart. He didn't mind the sound. The rage of the desert was an honest thing, unlike the quiet treachery of men. He was a man shaped by empty spaces, inside and out. The war had carved out the soft parts, and the years since, chasing bounties from dusty plains to hardscrabble mountain towns, had packed the hollows with little more than suspicion and solitude. His right hand, resting near the worn grip of his Colt, bore a puckered scar from a bayonet that had come too close. His leg ached with the memory of shrapnel, a dull throb that sang along with the rhythm of the wind. Sleep didn't come easy, but exhaustion was a reliable companion. He was just starting to drift into its gray embrace when a sound cut through the gale. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint, desperate fumbling at the flap of his tent. Instinct, honed by 1,000 nights under hostile stars, took over. In one fluid motion, he was off the bedroll, the heavy weight of the peacemaker cool and solid in his hand. He didn't make a sound, melting into the deepest shadow of the small space. His heart hammered a slow, steady beat against his ribs. It could be anything, a desperate animal, a lost prospector, or it could be trouble looking for a place to happen. In Elias's experience, trouble had a way of finding him. The tent flap lifted, letting in a furious swirl of sand and a silhouette. Small and stooped against the roaring dark, the figure stumbled inside, then fell to its knees with a choked sob, pulling the flap closed and plunging the tent back into near total blackness. The intruder was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, a sound of utter depletion. Elias cocked the hammer on the Colt. The click was unnervingly loud in the relative quiet. "Don't move," he said. His voice was rust, a low rasp that hadn't been used for conversation in days. The figure froze. A small gasp, sharp with terror, was swallowed by the storm. "Not 1 inch," Elias warned, his eyes straining to make out a shape. He could smell rain on the wind and something else, something clean, like soap and fear. Bandits didn't smell of soap. He kept the gun steady, his other hand fumbling for the tin lantern and the box of lucifer matches on his crate. His fingers found them. The small wooden stick gritty with sand. He struck it against the box. It failed. He struck another. The sulfur flared. A tiny, defiant sun. He touched it to the lantern's wick. A soft, golden light bloomed, pushing back the shadows, and he saw it wasn't a bandit. It wasn't a prospector. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19. Kneeling on the dirt floor, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to hold in a scream. Her bonnet was gone, and her dark hair had been torn from its pins by the wind, framing a face pale with exhaustion and streaked with grime. Her dress, a simple thing of brown calico, was torn at the hem and coated in a fine layer of red dust. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and dark, the color of a deep river, and in their depths swam a desperate fear that was so pure, so profound. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. His gun hand didn't waver, but something inside him did. His mind, trained to assess threats, to see price tags and dead or alive posters, saw none here. Instead, for the first time in a decade, it saw something else entirely. It was a mistake. A girl stumbling into the wrong tent, a bounty hunter finding an innocent in his sights, a dangerous, complicated mistake in that single, flickering moment as the wind howled its lonely sermon outside. Elias Boone looked at the terrified girl and saw the mistake he'd pray to make again. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the hammer of the pistol, and set it down on the crate beside the lantern. The gesture seemed to echo in the small space. The girl watched him, her breathing still hitched and uneven. She looked from the gun to his face, a face that was all harsh angles and sun-cured leather, shadowed by a dark beard that needed trimming. His eyes were the faded blue of a prairie sky after a long drought, and they carried a weariness that went far beyond the need for sleep. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice still rough but without the hard edge of a threat. She swallowed, her throat working against the dust. "Lila," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lila May Carter." He grunted, a non-committal sound. "You've got a bad sense of direction. Lila May Carter." "The storm," she said, finding her voice a little more. "I was with a wagon train. I got separated. I saw the light." He glanced at the lantern. He hadn't had it lit. She was lying or mistaken. He decided it didn't matter which. "There was no light," he stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Tears welled in her eyes, mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. "I just saw shelter. I didn't know anyone was here. I'm sorry, I'll go." She made a move to stand, her limbs trembling with cold and fatigue. "Stay put," he ordered, his tone firm but not unkind. "Going out there now is a fool's death. The storm will let up by morning." He picked up his canteen from the floor and held it out to her. "Water." She hesitated, her gaze fixed on his scarred hand. He saw the flicker of doubt, the ingrained caution of a young woman alone with a strange, armed man in the middle of a wilderness. He couldn't blame her. He wouldn't have trusted himself either. "It's just water," he said, his patience thin. "Drink it or don't." Slowly, she reached out and took the heavy canteen. Her fingers brushed his, and the touch was like a spark on dry tinder. She was so alive, her skin warm despite the cold. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin. And when she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand like a child. She looked up at him, the fear in her eyes softening just a fraction, replaced by a deep, bone-weary gratitude. "Thank you," she said. He just nodded, turning away to busy himself with nothing, rearranging the meager contents of his crate, a tin of coffee, a pouch of tobacco, a spare box of cartridges. The ordinary tools of his solitary life seemed foreign and strange in her presence. The tent, which had always felt just big enough for one man and his ghosts, now felt impossibly small. Her scent, the soap and the rain and the faint perfume of her hair, filled the small space, an unwelcome invasion of his carefully constructed emptiness. He gestured with his chin toward his bedroll. "You can take that. I'll sit." "Oh, no, I couldn't," she protested immediately. "It's yours. I can sit here." "It wasn't a request," he said flatly. He sat down on the hard-packed earth, his back against the crate, and drew one knee up, resting his arm on it. The position was casual, but it kept his gun hand free and gave him a clear view of her and the tent flap. Old habits died hard, or they didn't die at all. Lila May watched him for a long moment, then seemed to decide that arguing was a waste of energy she didn't have. She crawled over to the bedroll, a simple canvas sack stuffed with a wool blanket, and curled up on it, pulling the rough fabric around her shoulders. She was still fully dressed, her dusty boots still on her feet. Within minutes, the steady, rhythmic sound of her breathing told him she was asleep, claimed by an exhaustion so complete it overrode her fear. Elias sat in the lantern light and watched her. The storm began to lose its fury, its shriek mellowing to a mournful moan. He should be sleeping too, gathering his strength for the trail ahead. But sleep was a distant country. He studied the girl, the way her chest rose and fell, the smudge of dirt high on her cheekbone, the way a stray lock of dark hair lay across her forehead. She looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile for a place like this. A preacher's daughter. She'd said he could see it now. There was a certain sheltered quality about her, an innocence that hadn't yet been scoured away by the world. It was an innocence he had long since forgotten, if he had ever known it at all. He knew what he ought to do. When morning came, he'd point her in the direction of the nearest settlement, Silver Creek, a day's ride east. It was a miserable collection of tents, shacks, and saloons, crawling with miners and grifters. But it passed for civilization. He'd give her water and a piece of hardtack and send her on her way. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. A girl like her was trouble, not because of what she might do, but because of what she was. She was a complication, a loose thread in the tightly woven, predictable pattern of his life. He chased men for money. He moved on. He answered to no one. That was his creed. But as he sat there in the quiet tent, the lantern flame casting dancing shadows on the canvas, he looked at her sleeping form and felt the foundations of his world shift. He thought of the road to Silver Creek, the bandits and the sun, the snakes and the thirst. He thought of her walking it alone, a flicker of something protective. An instinct he thought the war had shot out of him, stirred in his chest. It was a foolish, dangerous feeling. It was a feeling that could get a man killed. Outside, the last of the storm blew past, and the clouds parted. A sliver of a desert moon cast a pale, ethereal light over the land, a silent witness in the immense, listening quiet of the night. Elias Boone reached over and turned down the lantern's wick, plunging the tent into soft darkness. But he did not close his eyes. He just sat there, guarding the sleep of the girl who had entered the wrong tent, a mistake he was already beginning to understand he was bound to make again. The wind had teeth and a devil's voice. It screamed across the Arizona territory, a raw, scouring sound that peeled the skin from the land and sent sand spiraling into the bruised twilight. The grit was everywhere, in a man's mouth, in the folds of his clothes, in the chamber of his gun if he wasn't careful. Elias Boone was always careful. He lay on his bedroll, the canvas walls of his small tent shuddering around him, and listened to the storm try to tear his temporary world apart. He didn't mind the sound. The rage of the desert was an honest thing, unlike the quiet treachery of men. He was a man shaped by empty spaces, inside and out. The war had carved out the soft parts, and the years since, chasing bounties from dusty plains to hardscrabble mountain towns, had packed the hollows with little more than suspicion and solitude. His right hand, resting near the worn grip of his Colt, bore a puckered scar from a bayonet that had come too close. His leg ached with the memory of shrapnel, a dull throb that sang along with the rhythm of the wind. Sleep didn't come easy, but exhaustion was a reliable companion. He was just starting to drift into its gray embrace when a sound cut through the gale. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint, desperate fumbling at the flap of his tent. Instinct, honed by 1,000 nights under hostile stars, took over. In one fluid motion, he was off the bedroll, the heavy weight of the peacemaker cool and solid in his hand. He didn't make a sound, melting into the deepest shadow of the small space. His heart hammered a slow, steady beat against his ribs. It could be anything, a desperate animal, a lost prospector, or it could be trouble looking for a place to happen. In Elias's experience, trouble had a way of finding him. The tent flap lifted, letting in a furious swirl of sand and a silhouette, small and stooped against the roaring dark. The figure stumbled inside, then fell to its knees with a choked sob, pulling the flap closed and plunging the tent back into near total blackness. The intruder was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, a sound of utter depletion. Elias cocked the hammer on the Colt. The click was unnervingly loud in the relative quiet. "Don't move," he said. His voice was rust, a low rasp that hadn't been used for conversation in days. The figure froze. A small gasp, sharp with terror, was swallowed by the storm. "Not 1 inch," Elias warned, his eyes straining to make out a shape. He could smell rain on the wind and something else, something clean, like soap and fear. Bandits didn't smell of soap. He kept the gun steady, his other hand fumbling for the tin lantern and the box of lucifer matches on his crate. His fingers found them, the small wooden stick gritty with sand. He struck it against the box. It failed. He struck another. The sulfur flared. A tiny, defiant sun. He touched it to the lantern's wick. A soft, golden light bloomed, pushing back the shadows, and he saw. It wasn't a bandit. It wasn't a prospector. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19, kneeling on the dirt floor, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to hold in a scream. Her bonnet was gone, and her dark hair had been torn from its pins by the wind, framing a face pale with exhaustion and streaked with grime. Her dress, a simple thing of brown calico, was torn at the hem and coated in a fine layer of red dust. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and dark, the color of a deep river, and in their depth swam a desperate fear that was so pure, so profound. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. His gun hand didn't waver, but something inside him did. His mind, trained to assess threats, to see price tags and dead or alive posters, saw none here. Instead, for the first time in a decade, it saw something else entirely. It was a mistake. A girl stumbling into the wrong tent, a bounty hunter finding an innocent in his sights, a dangerous, complicated mistake. In that single, flickering moment, as the wind howled its lonely sermon outside. Elias Boone looked at the terrified girl and saw the mistake he'd pray to make again. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the hammer of the pistol and set it down on the crate beside the lantern. The gesture seemed to echo in the small space. The girl watched him, her breathing still hitched and uneven. She looked from the gun to his face, a face that was all harsh angles and sun-cured leather, shadowed by a dark beard that needed trimming. His eyes were the faded blue of a prairie sky after a long drought, and they carried a weariness that went far beyond the need for sleep. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice still rough but without the hard edge of a threat. She swallowed, her throat working against the dust. "Lila," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lila May Carter." He grunted, a non-committal sound. "You've got a bad sense of direction. Lila May Carter?" "The storm," she said, finding her voice a little more. "I was with a wagon train. I got separated. I saw the light." He glanced at the lantern. He hadn't had it lit. She was lying or mistaken. He decided it didn't matter which. There was no light, he stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Tears welled in her eyes, mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. "I just saw shelter. I didn't know anyone was here. I'm sorry. I'll go." She made a move to stand, her limbs trembling with cold and fatigue. "Stay put," he ordered, his tone firm but not unkind. "Going out there now is a fool's death. The storm will let up by morning." He picked up his canteen from the floor and held it out to her. "Water." She hesitated, her gaze fixed on his scarred hand. He saw the flicker of doubt, the ingrained caution of a young woman alone with a strange, armed man in the middle of a wilderness. He couldn't blame her. He wouldn't have trusted himself either. "It's just water," he said, his patience thin. "Drink it or don't." Slowly, she reached out and took the heavy canteen. Her fingers brushed his, and the touch was like a spark on dry tinder. She was so alive, her skin warm despite the cold. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin, and when she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand like a child. She looked up at him, the fear in her eyes softening just a fraction, replaced by a deep, bone-weary gratitude. "Thank you," she said. He just nodded, turning away to busy himself with nothing, rearranging the meager contents of his crate, a tin of coffee, a pouch of tobacco, a spare box of cartridges. The ordinary tools of his solitary life seemed foreign and strange in her presence. The tent, which had always felt just big enough for one man and his ghosts, now felt impossibly small. Her scent, The soap and the rain and the faint perfume of her hair filled the small space, an unwelcome invasion of his carefully constructed emptiness. He gestured with his chin toward his bedroll. "You can take that. I'll sit." "Oh, no, I couldn't," she protested immediately. "It's yours. I can sit here." "It wasn't a request," he said flatly. He sat down on the hard-packed earth, his back against the crate, and drew one knee up, resting his arm on it. The position was casual, but it kept his gun hand free and gave him a clear view of her and the tent flap. Old habits died hard, or they didn't die at all. Lila May watched him for a long moment, then seemed to decide that arguing was a waste of energy she didn't have. She crawled over to the bedroll, a simple canvas sack stuffed with a wool blanket, and curled up on it, pulling the rough fabric around her shoulders. She was still fully dressed, her dusty boots still on her feet. Within minutes, the steady, rhythmic sound of her breathing told him she was asleep, claimed by an exhaustion so complete it overrode her fear. Elias sat in the lantern light and watched her. The storm began to lose its fury, its shriek mellowing to a mournful moan. He should be sleeping too, gathering his strength for the trail ahead. But sleep was a distant country. He studied the girl, the way her chest rose and fell, the smudge of dirt high on her cheekbone, the way a stray lock of dark hair lay across her forehead. She looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile for a place like this, a preacher's daughter. She'd said. He could see it now. There was a certain sheltered quality about her, an innocence that hadn't yet been scoured away by the world. It was an innocence he had long since forgotten, if he had ever known it at all. He knew what he ought to do. When morning came, he'd point her in the direction of the nearest settlement, Silver Creek, a day's ride east. It was a miserable collection of tents, shacks, and saloons, crawling with miners and grifters. But it passed for civilization. He'd give her water and a piece of hardtack and send her on her way. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. A girl like her was trouble, not because of what she might do, but because of what she was. She was a complication, a loose thread in the tightly woven, predictable pattern of his life. He chased men for money. He moved on. He answered to no one. That was his creed. But as he sat there in the quiet tent, the lantern flame casting dancing shadows on the canvas, he looked at her sleeping form and felt the foundations of his world shift. He thought of the road to Silver Creek, the bandits and the sun, the snakes and the thirst. He thought of her walking it alone, a flicker of something protective, an instinct he thought the war had shot out of him, stirred in his chest. It was a foolish, dangerous feeling. It was a feeling that could get a man killed. Outside, the last of the storm blew past, and the clouds parted. A sliver of a desert moon cast a pale, ethereal light over the land, a silent witness in the immense, listening quiet of the night. Elias Boone reached over and turned down the lantern's wick, plunging the tent into soft darkness, but he did not close his eyes. He just sat there, guarding the sleep of the girl who had entered the wrong tent, a mistake he was already beginning to understand he was bound to make again. The morning broke quiet and clean, the air scrubbed raw by the storm. When Lila May woke, the tent was filled with a soft, gray light. The rhythmic shuddering of the canvas had ceased, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to press in from all sides. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the wind, the fear, and the dark shape of the man with the gun rushed back. She sat up, her heart giving a nervous leap. He was gone. The bedroll where he'd sat guard was empty. She scrambled out of the tent, her muscles stiff and aching. The desert was transformed. The red earth was dark with moisture, and the air smelled of rain and damp creosote bush. A small fire of mesquite twigs crackled nearby, and beside it, Elias Boone knelt, tending to a battered tin coffee pot. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. His horse, a sturdy buckskin, stood tethered a few yards away, placidly stripping the leaves from a palo verde tree. "There's coffee," he said, his voice as gritty as the landscape. He gestured with a tin cup toward another one sitting on a flat rock. "Thank you." She took the cup, its heat a welcome shock against her cold hands. The coffee was black, bitter, and strong enough to wake the dead. She sipped it, watching him over the rim. In the clear morning light, he looked even harsher, his face a map of hard miles and harder memories. "We need to get moving," he said, staring into the fire. "Silver Creek is a day's ride, longer on foot. The sooner we start, the better." "The wagon train," she began, the lie feeling clumsy and heavy on her tongue. "Do you think we can find them?" Elias finally looked at her. His faded blue eyes were unnervingly direct. "There was no wagon train. Was there, Miss Carter?" He said it quietly, without judgment. "At least, not one you were still with. You ran." The accusation, gentle as it was, made shame and defiance rise in her throat. She had been raised to believe that a lie was a direct offense against God, a stain upon the soul. But the truth felt just as dangerous. She clutched the warm cup. "How did you know?" "Your hands," he said, nodding toward them. "They're soft. Not the hands of a girl who's been 3 weeks on a prairie schooner. And your shoes," he glanced at her worn but clearly not trail-beaten boots. "They're made for church pews, not for cactus." He took a sip of his own coffee. "And you're a terrible liar." The simple, blunt truth of it broke her. Tears she thought had been spent in the storm pricked her eyes. "My father," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He's the preacher in Harmony Glen. He arranged a marriage for me. To Mr. Abernathy. He owns the mercantile. He's 40 years old and a widower twice over, and his hands are always damp." She shuddered at the memory. "Father said it was a blessing. A righteous match that would secure my future and the church's accounts. He said my duty was to obey." Elias listened, his expression unreadable. "My life was all duty," she went on, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "Duty to God, duty to my father. Every book I read was approved. Every friendship was monitored. Every hour of my day was accounted for. This marriage, it wasn't just a future I didn't want. It was the end of any future at all. It was a cage made of scripture and lace. So I took what little money I had. And I left. I paid for passage on a wagon train heading west. But I left it 2 nights ago. I thought I could make it on my own." Her voice broke. "I was a fool." Elias finished his coffee and tossed the grounds into the fire, where they sizzled and smoked. He was quiet for so long that Lila began to think he would say nothing at all, that he would simply saddle his horse and leave her there. The thought terrified her more than the storm had. "Plenty of fools out here," he said at last, not looking at her. "Most of them are running from something. A rope, a debt, a promise. A cage is as good a reason as any." He stood up, the motion economical and decisive. "Finish your coffee. We're burning daylight." Relief washed over her, so potent it left her weak. He wasn't going to leave her. He wasn't going to drag her back to her father. He had heard the truth of her, and he hadn't turned away. The journey was harder than anything Lila had ever known. Elias set a relentless pace, and since he only had one horse, they walked, the buckskin carrying their meager supplies. The sun climbed, beating down with a fierce, dry heat that seemed to leach the moisture from her body. The ground was uneven, a treacherous mix of rock and sand that twisted her ankles and wore blisters through her thin stockings. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the heat. Elias seemed to prefer it, his attention fixed on the horizon, his hand never far from the butt of his gun. Lila, however, was accustomed to a life filled with words, sermons, hymns, quiet admonishments. The silence felt unnatural, and she found herself trying to fill it. She asked him about the names of the strange, spiny plants, about the distant mountains that shimmered purple in the haze, about his horse. He answered in monosyllables, his responses clipped and reluctant, discouraging further conversation. He was a locked box, and she had no key. Yet, as the day wore on, she began to notice things. He always found the easiest path for her, steering her away from loose rock or dense patches of cholla cactus. He stopped for water breaks more often than she suspected he would have on his own, watching to make sure she drank deeply from the canteen. He wasn't kind, not in the way her father preached about kindness, which was a public, performative thing. Elias's was a quiet, practical sort of decency. So understated she might have missed it if she wasn't looking so hard. Late in the afternoon, they topped a low mesa. Below them, a trail of dust marked the passage of a small wagon train, maybe 2 or 3 wagons, lumbering slowly westward. "Is that?" Lila began. Before she could finish, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed up the canyon walls. Puffs of smoke erupted from a rocky outcrop overlooking the trail. Riders spurred their horses from hiding, descending on the wagons like vultures. It happened so fast. Men shouted, women screamed, and the pop of pistols joined the deeper boom of rifles. Lila froze, her hand flying to her mouth, her mind unable to process the sudden, brutal violence. But Elias was already moving. In an instant, he was a different man. The weary drifter vanished, replaced by someone cold, focused, and lethal. He grabbed the horse's reins with one hand and her arm with the other, his grip like iron. "Get down," he snarled, pulling her behind a cluster of boulders. The air was filled with the whine of ricocheting bullets. He peered over the rock, his eyes narrowed, assessing the fight below with a professional calm that chilled her to the bone. Damn scavengers, too brazen for their own good. A few of the attackers had spotted them on the ridge. 2 riders broke away from the main group and started up the slope toward them. Elias cursed under his breath. He pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard. "We can't outrun them here. We go into the rocks, stay behind me, and do exactly as I say." He fired a single shot from the rifle, not at the men, but at the rocks just above them. The bullet sent stone chips flying, and their horses shied, giving Elias the precious seconds he needed. Now, they scrambled into a narrow, winding wash, the horse clattering behind them. The canyons became a labyrinth of stone and shadow. Elias moved with a swift, sure-footed grace, his rifle held at the ready. Lila stumbled after him, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs with a terror that was stark and absolute. This was the West she had read about in dime novels, but stripped of all romance, it was just ugly, loud, and deadly. He found what he was looking for, a deep crevice, almost a cave, hidden behind a curtain of desert willow. He pushed her inside, then led the horse in after her before pulling the branches back into place. They were plunged into cool shadow. The sounds of the fight were muffled now, distant and unreal. They could hear the shouts of the men searching for them, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. Elias stood at the entrance, motionless, his rifle pointed toward the light, listening. Lila pressed herself against the cold stone wall, trying to silence her ragged breathing. They stood that way for what felt like an eternity, trapped in the tight, dark space. The only sounds the horse's soft snorting and the frantic beat of her own heart. Finally, the voices faded, and the gunshots stopped. Silence returned. Elias didn't relax. He waited, listening to the desert reclaim its quiet. When he finally turned from the entrance, his face was grim in the dim light. The adrenaline that had carried Lila through the chase drained away, leaving a sick, trembling weakness in its place. "Are you—" she started, her voice a reedy whisper. "Have you ever had to—" She couldn't finish the question. He knew what she was asking. He leaned the rifle against the rock wall and sank down, his back against it, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. He looked at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the calloused palms. "Yes," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "More times than I can count. In the war. After—" He fell silent. She watched him, seeing not just the bounty hunter, but a man haunted by the ghosts of his own actions. An unexpected wave of empathy washed over her fear. "The war," she prompted gently. He picked up a small stone, turning it over and over in his fingers. "We were boys, sent to do a man's work, but we were just boys. I had a friend, Jacob. We were from the same county. He couldn't take it. The noise, the blood, the dying. One night, he just walked away from his post. They caught him the next morning." Elias's voice grew lower, rougher. "The captain called it desertion in the face of the enemy. Made an example of him. He ordered me to be part of the firing squad." He paused, and the silence in the cave was absolute. I can still see his face. He wasn't scared. Not at the end. He just looked tired. He looked right at me and nodded, like he was giving me permission. The captain gave the order. Elias's knuckles were white where he gripped the stone. I pulled the trigger. That's the sin you don't wash off. Not with whiskey. Not with miles. It just stays with you. Lila felt a profound ache in her chest, a sorrow so deep it was almost physical. He wasn't a monster. He was a man carrying a wound that would not heal. Without thinking, she moved closer and sat on the dusty floor near him. "My father preached about sin every Sunday," she said softly. "He made it sound like a choice, like a weakness of character. He never talked about sin that was ordered, sin you were forced into." She looked at their surroundings, the stone walls that had protected them. "My whole life, I've been afraid of sinning, afraid of disappointing God, of being cast out. My prison didn't have bars, it had scripture. I was so afraid of making a mistake that I never truly lived at all." He finally looked at her, and in the gloom of their hiding place, a fragile, unspoken understanding passed between them. It wasn't the spark of attraction, not the heat of desire. It was something quieter, deeper. It was the recognition of a fellow captive. He was a man imprisoned by a single, terrible act of sin. She was a girl imprisoned by a lifetime of enforced, suffocating righteousness. In that shared moment of raw vulnerability, surrounded by the silence of the high desert, they saw the walls of each other's cages, and for the first time, for both of them, those walls didn't seem quite so high. They rode into Silver Creek under the harsh glare of the midday sun. It was less a town and more an open wound on the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, hastily erected wooden storefronts, and saloons whose bat-wing doors never seemed to stop swinging. The single street was a river of ankle-deep dust, churned by the passage of ore wagons, mules, and men whose faces were grim with the fever of prospecting. The air was thick with the smells of cheap whiskey, frying bacon, and the metallic tang of the nearby mines. For Elias, it was a familiar kind of purgatory. For Lila, it was terrifying. He led the horse to a livery stable that leaned as if tired of standing, paid the owner a few coins, and then turned to her. The resolve he'd forged during the night felt brittle in the daylight. "There's a boarding house at the end of the street. It's not much, but it's a roof." He walked, and she followed, a small, out-of-place figure in her dusty calico dress. Men stopped to stare, their gazes lingering on her with a rough curiosity that made her skin crawl. They saw her youth, her evident gentility, and they saw the hard-faced man she was with, and they drew their own conclusions. Lila kept her eyes fixed on Elias's back, a lone point of stability in a swirling sea of judgment. The boarding house was run by a stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Elias paid for a week in advance for a small room at the back. He placed the key and a few worn silver dollars on the counter in front of Lila. "This should hold you for a bit," he said, his voice low. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the door, on the dusty street beyond, on his escape. "Get some food, some rest. Someone will be heading to a real town from here sooner or later. You can buy passage." His part was done. He had brought her to safety, such as it was. Now he could disappear back into the desert, back into the simple, uncomplicated life of a man who travels alone. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, It felt like swallowing sand. Lila looked at the money, then up at his face. Her expression was a mixture of gratitude and a deep, bottomless fear. "Where will you go?" "Away," he said. It was the only honest answer he had. He turned to leave, a clean break, just as he'd planned. "Hold on there." The voice that stopped him was calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Elias turned slowly. The man standing in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, with a sun-bleached mustache and a silver star pinned to his vest. He wasn't a gunslinger playing at the law. He was the genuine article. His eyes, a cool, steady gray, moved from Elias to Lila, and back again. "Marshal Wade," he said, by way of introduction. "I'd like a word with you." Elias didn't move. "I've got nothing to say." "A man matching your description riding with a young lady matching hers was seen coming over the pass this morning," Wade said, his tone conversational. "Funny thing is, I got a telegraph yesterday. A preacher over in Harmony Glen is missing his daughter. Name of Lila Mae Carter. Says she ran off. He's offering a reward for her safe return." He looked directly at Lila, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, miss?" Lila's face went pale. The world she had run from had reached out and found her. I'm fine. Marshal, this man, he helped me. I was lost in the storm." Wade nodded slowly, his gaze shifting back to Elias, his eyes hardening once more. "Helped you. I see. A man like you has a habit of helping folks. Boon, usually for a price." Elias stiffened. The marshal knew his name. That changed things. "She was in trouble. I brought her to town. That's the end of it." "Is it?" Wade stepped fully into the room, letting the door swing shut behind him. "Or is it that you heard about the reward and decided to collect? Or maybe you had something else in mind entirely?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. "I don't like the smell of it. Boone, I want you to stay in Silver Creek until I can get this sorted out. Don't even think about leaving." Wade tipped his hat to Lila. "If you need anything, Miss Carter, my office is across the street." He gave Elias one last, long look, a clear warning, and then he was gone. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken threats. Elias felt the walls of the town closing in. He was a wolf caught in a pen, and the shepherd had his eye on him. He turned to Lila, a hard frustration in his eyes. "You should have kept your mouth shut." "I told the truth," she whispered, her voice trembling. The truth just got complicated. He bit out. He needed a drink. He needed to think. He stalked out of the boarding house, leaving her alone with the key, the silver dollars, and the weight of the law's suspicion. The saloon was crowded, a loud, smoky den of desperation and false hope. Elias ignored the curious glances and made his way to the bar, ordering a whiskey. He drank it in one go, the burn in his throat a familiar comfort. He was scanning the room, a habit he never broke, when he saw it, pinned to a board behind the bar. Amongst notices for mining claims and livestock auctions was a piece of paper. It wasn't an official bounty, printed and neat. This one was hand-scrawled, the lettering crude and angry. It promised $500, in gold, for the man who brought in Elias Boone, dead or alive. It was signed by Jedediah Crow. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Jedediah was the brother of Silas Crow, a murderous outlaw he'd tracked and brought in dead a year ago. He'd heard the rest of the Crow gang was looking for vengeance, but he'd thought he'd thrown them off his trail in the New Mexico territory. He was wrong. They were here, or they had ears here. $500 was a fortune in a town like Silver Creek. Every down-on-his-luck prospector, every gunslick looking to make a name for himself, was now a potential threat. Marshal Wade was the law, the Crow gang was the sin, and he was caught squarely in the middle. He left the saloon, the whiskey doing little to calm the coiled tension inside him. He walked the dusty street, his senses on high alert, seeing the town now not as a refuge for Lila, but as a trap for them both. He saw the way men looked at him, and he wondered if they were just curious, or if they were measuring him for a coffin. Lila, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle. The boarding house owner had looked through her as if she were made of glass, when she'd gone to the general store to buy a bar of soap and a loaf of bread. The storekeeper's wife had served her with a pinched, disapproving silence. She felt the sting of their judgment more keenly than the desert sun. She was the fallen woman, the runaway preacher's daughter, the companion of a wanted man. In their eyes, her story was simple and sordid. Her flight to freedom had led her directly into a different kind of prison, one made of whispers and sidelong glances. She retreated to her small, airless room and sat on the lumpy mattress, the weight of her choice pressing down on her. She had wanted to stand on her own 2 feet, but she felt more alone and unsteady than ever. She was afraid of the marshal, of the town, of what her father would do when he found her, and underneath it all, a new fear was taking root, a fear of her feelings for the complicated, dangerous man who had saved her. She depended on him, and that dependence chafed against her newfound desire for independence. As twilight bled across the sky, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers, Elias appeared at her door. He didn't knock, just pushed it open and stepped inside, his presence filling the tiny room. His face was set in grim lines. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now, I'll get the horse. Pack whatever you have." Lila stared at him, her heart beginning to pound. "Leaving, but the marshal said—" "To hell with the marshal," he cut in. "There are other men in this town looking for me, men who won't bother with questions or a trial. Staying here is a death sentence, for me, and trouble for you. I can get you clear of here, take you somewhere safe." He was offering her an escape, a continuation of their journey. He was offering her his protection. A day ago, she would have clung to that offer like a drowning woman to a log. But something had shifted in her. She had faced down a storm, survived an attack, and endured the scorn of a town. A fragile, tender shoot of resolve was growing in the barren soil of her fear. She stood up, her small frame straight and unyielding. "No." The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a gunshot. Elias stared at her, uncomprehending. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "I won't run anymore. Elias, I left my home because I was tired of being told what to do, where to go, who to be. I didn't run from that cage just to lock myself in another one, even if it's for my own protection." Her dark eyes flashed with a fire he had never seen before. "This is my life now. The consequences, the judgment, the danger. It's mine. I will not be scared away. I'm staying in Silver Creek." Her defiance stunned him. He saw the folly in it, the naive courage that could get her killed. But he also saw its purity. She was no longer just the lost girl who had stumbled into his tent. She was a woman staking a claim, drawing a line in the dust, not with a gun, but with a simple, unshakable act of will. He was trapped. He couldn't force her to go, and looking at her, standing there in the dim light, so terribly vulnerable and so incredibly brave, he knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that he couldn't leave her behind either. Her refusal hung between them, a declaration of war against the very fate he was trying to save her from. Elias saw the futility of arguing. The fearlessness in her was as stubborn and unyielding as the desert rock. He couldn't force her, and he couldn't leave. He was anchored to this dusty, dangerous town by a thread of connection he didn't understand and couldn't bring himself to break. He gave a short, frustrated nod and left her room, the weight of his decision to stay settling on him like a shroud. The next 2 days passed in a state of suspended tension. Elias became a ghost, sticking to the shadows, his senses stretched taut as a wire. He moved Lila from the boarding house, with its prying eyes and thin walls, to his small tent pitched in a secluded arroyo at the edge of town. It offered more privacy and a better field of fire. a grim calculation that he kept to himself. He slept in the open, a few yards away, leaving her the shelter of the canvas. It was a poor arrangement, but it was the best he could do. He was a man accustomed to solitude, yet he now found his world occupied by a singular, constant worry for the girl sleeping just feet away. Lila, for her part, tried to build a life from the dust. She found small tasks, mending her torn dress with a needle and thread bought at the general store, helping the livery owner groom the horses in exchange for a hot meal. Each task was an assertion of her independence, a small victory against the fear that gnawed at her. But she was always aware of Elias, a silent guardian moving on the periphery of her vision. She saw the way he watched the town, the way his hand hovered near his gun when strangers passed. She knew he was a coiled spring, and she knew she was the reason he couldn't unwind. The breaking point came on the third day. Their supplies were low, and Elias knew he couldn't avoid the center of town any longer. He went in late in the afternoon, when the sun was low and the shadows were long, hoping the crowds would provide cover. He needed coffee, flour, and cartridges. Most of all, he needed information. The saloon was the town's nervous system. Every rumor, every secret, passed through it eventually. He had to know if the Crow gang was still near. He pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Lucky Nugget saloon, and the noise hit him like a physical blow, a cacophony of tinny piano music, drunken laughter, and the clink of glasses. He kept his hat pulled low and made his way to the far end of the bar, ordering a whiskey he didn't want. He nursed the drink, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every face, every movement. He saw miners, a few prospectors, a card game in the corner. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He was beginning to think he'd been spooked by shadows when a man at the card table looked up. The man's eyes widened in recognition. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He nudged the man next to him, and then that man looked. Elias saw the flicker of avarice, the silent communication. They had seen the poster. They knew who he was. Elias placed his glass on the bar and turned to leave. It was too late. 3 men had risen from the table, spreading out to block his path. They weren't gunslingers, just hard-luck men who saw $500 standing in front of them. But a desperate man with a gun is still a dangerous man. "Well, look what we have here," the first man said, his hand moving to the pistol holstered on his hip. "Elias Boone, you're worth a fair piece of change." The saloon went quiet. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Every eye was on them. Elias didn't speak. He measured the distance between them, calculated the angles. His own hand rested on the grip of his Colt. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard," the man continued, his confidence growing in the silence. "There's no easy way," Elias said, his voice low and cold. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. The man drew his gun. But Elias was faster. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. He fired once. The man grunted and stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. The second man was already firing, his shot going wide, splintering the wood of the bar next to Elias's head. Elias pivoted and fired again. The second man fell. The third man, panicked, began shooting wildly. Patrons screamed and dove for cover. Glass shattered. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Elias's left arm. A hot, searing pain. He ignored it, aimed, and fired. The third man dropped his gun and clutched his leg, howling. The smoke cleared. 3 men were down. The silence was absolute, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Elias stood breathing heavily, the smell of gunpowder sharp in his nostrils. And then a 4th shot rang out. It came from the doorway. He hadn't seen the other man, the 4th member of the Crow gang, waiting outside. The bullet slammed into his side, a brutal, staggering blow that drove the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and blinding. He dropped to one knee, his vision swimming. He raised his gun, trying to find a target through the graying haze, and fired toward the door. There was a cry of pain, and then the sound of running footsteps. He had to get out. He pushed himself to his feet, his sides screaming in protest. He staggered toward the back of the saloon, leaving a trail of blood on the dusty floorboards. He burst through a back door into an alley, the sunlight a painful shock. He leaned against the rough wood of the building, his strength failing, the world tilting crazily around him. Lila had heard the gunshots. The sound, a sharp, deadly volley, had echoed across the quiet edge of town. Her blood went cold. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that Elias was in the middle of it. Without a second thought, she began to run. She ran toward the sound, toward the danger, her own rules and fears dissolving in the face of a more powerful, more terrifying instinct to find him. She found him in the alley, slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to his side, the fabric of his shirt dark and wet with blood. His face was ashen. Her heart stopped. "Elias," she cried, rushing to his side. He looked up, his eyes clouded with pain. "Lila, you have to run!" "No," she said, her voice fierce. She tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat and pressed it against the wound in his side. "I'm not leaving you." She looped his good arm over her shoulders, taking his weight. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of pain and muscle. She struggled, her feet slipping in the dust, but she didn't let go. They stumbled through the back alleys and arroyos, a desperate, bleeding pair, staying clear of the main street. Every step was an agony for him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time they reached the tent, he was barely conscious. She managed to get him inside, onto the bedroll. In the dim light, she saw the extent of the damage. The wound in his arm was clean, but the one in his side was ugly, still weeping blood. He was shivering, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow. A fever was already taking hold. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it back. There was no one else. There was only her. She remembered watching her mother tend to the sick, the quiet competence, the gentle hands. She built up the fire, put a pot of water on to boil, and found his small stash of medical supplies, a bottle of carbolic acid, a few clean rags, and a flask of whiskey. She cleaned the wounds as best she could, her touch surprisingly steady. He was mostly delirious now, muttering things she couldn't understand, his body tense with pain. She poured whiskey over the wounds, and he cried out, a raw animal sound that tore at her heart. He thrashed, and she had to hold him down, her hands on his shoulders, whispering to him, soothing him as if he were a frightened child. She saw the old, faded scars that mapped his body, a testament to a life of violence she could barely imagine. For hours, she sat by his side, bathing his face with a cool, damp cloth, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind lost in a fevered desert of its own. He spoke of the war, of mud and smoke, of a boy named Jacob. He cried out orders and whispered apologies to ghosts only he could see. Sometime deep in the night, his eyes fluttered open. They were glassy with fever, but for a moment, they seemed to see her, truly see her. He reached up, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. His fingers were rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "Lila?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of pain and a kind of wondering confusion. A mistake. She leaned closer, trying to catch the words. "What? Elias, what is it?" His gaze held hers. "If finding you was a mistake," he breathed, the words clear and sharp in the quiet tent, "I'd pray to make it again." The words struck her with more force than any sermon. It was a confession, wrung from him by pain and fever, a truth he would never have spoken with his guard up. This man, who had tried so hard to push her away, to leave her behind, saw her not as a burden or a complication, but as a mistake so precious he would choose it again. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She held his hand, pressing it to her cheek. Outside, the desert was silent, a vast, empty wilderness under a canopy of stars. For her entire life, she had seen it as a godless place, a barren wasteland. But now, she understood. The desert was not empty. It was just waiting for the rare, precious rain that would bring forth the tiny, vibrant flowers that lay dormant beneath the sand. She looked at the man lying before her, his life a wasteland of violence and regret. And she looked at herself, her life a parched and sterile garden of rigid rules. They were two dry, barren souls, and this thing that was growing between them, this terrifying, powerful emotion, it was the rain. In that moment, kneeling in the dust beside a wounded man in a lonely tent, Lila Mae Carter's faith was transformed. She realized that love was not the opposite of righteousness. It wasn't a sin to be avoided. Love, she understood, was its own form of grace. It didn't matter if it began with a mistake, or if it was found in the heart of a killer, if it could reach into a soul lost in darkness and pull it toward the light. Then it was not just love, it was salvation. The fever broke 2 days later, leaving Elias weak as a newborn colt, but clear-headed for the first time since the gunfight. He lay on the bedroll, watching as Lila moved about the small tent, her presence a quiet, constant source of warmth and light. She had saved his life. He knew it with a certainty that went deeper than thought. She had cleaned his wounds, fed him broth, and sat with him through the long, dark hours of his delirium. He owed her a debt he could never repay. He also knew he was putting her in mortal danger. His presence made her an outlaw's accomplice. The Crow gang was still out there, and Marshall Wade was still suspicious. Her brave stand to stay in Silver Creek was a fool's errand as long as she was tied to him. There was only one way to cut the rope.
"Lila,"
he said, his voice a hoarse croak. She was at his side in an instant, a cup of water in her hand. He drank, then pushed himself into a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the sharp protest from his side. "I'm going to see the marshal." Her eyes widened in alarm. "You can't. You're not strong enough. They'll put you in jail." "Maybe," he conceded. "But it's better than waiting for the Crows to find us here and put us both in the ground. I have to face this. Clear my name, and yours." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "You can't build a life hiding in the shadows with me. You deserve the sun." No amount of pleading could change his mind. An hour later, he was on his feet, leaning on her for support as they walked slowly toward the center of town. He was a grim sight, his clothes stained with blood, his face pale and drawn. The townspeople stopped and stared as they passed, their whispers following them like buzzing flies. He walked directly into the marshal's office and stood before the desk, swaying slightly. "Boone," Wade said, his expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "I was about to come looking for you." "I'm turning myself in," Elias said, his voice flat. "The men in the saloon, they were Crows, or riding with them. They came after the bounty on my head. It was self-defense." Before Wade could respond, the office door swung open with a crash. A tall, severe-looking man stood there, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. He was dressed in the black, sober suit of a preacher, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He looked past Elias, past the marshal, and fixed his gaze on Lila. "Lila Mae," he boomed, his voice accustomed to filling a church. "So this is the den of iniquity where you've hidden yourself, forsaking your God, your family, for the company of a killer." Lila shrank back, all the fight draining out of her. "Father," she whispered. It was Reverend Carter. He had found her. He strode into the room and grabbed her arm, his grip unforgiving. "You are coming home. We will pray for your fallen soul and beg the Lord's forgiveness for this shameful spectacle." "Hold on now, Reverend," Marshal Wade said, rising from his chair. "The girl hasn't broken any laws." "She has broken God's law," Carter thundered, his eyes blazing. "She has disgraced my name and my ministry. She will be redeemed, whether she wishes it or not." He began to pull a terrified Lila toward the door. Elias stepped between them, his weak body trembling with the effort. "Let her go." Reverend Carter looked Elias up and down with utter contempt. You are the serpent in my daughter's Eden. You will answer to God for this." "Maybe I will," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But right now, you'll answer to me. Take your hands off her." The tension in the small office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marshal Wade put his hand on his gun. "Reverend, this is a legal matter now. I suggest you calm yourself." He looked from the preacher's fanatical glare to Elias's cold fury to Lila's terrified face. "There's only one place to sort this out. The whole town is already whispering. We'll do this in the open." He nodded toward the street. "In the church." The Silver Creek Church was a simple wooden structure with a dusty bell and a few rows of hard-backed pews. But that afternoon, it became a courtroom. Word had spread like wildfire, and the pews were filled with the curious and the judgmental. It was a spectacle, and the town had come to watch. Lila stood at the front, near the pulpit, with her father on one side and Marshal Wade on the other. Elias was made to sit in the front pew, weak and wounded, a prisoner in all but name. Reverend Carter began to preach. He spoke of prodigal daughters and the snares of the devil. He did not use Lila's name, but every word was a stone cast directly at her. He called her a lost girl, a lamb who had strayed from the flock to lie with wolves. The townspeople murmured their agreement. Lila stood with her head bowed, the weight of their condemnation pressing down on her, her shame a physical cloak. She felt herself shrinking, dissolving, becoming the lost, sinful child her father described. Then she looked at Elias. He was watching her, his face pale with pain, but his eyes were locked on hers. In their depths, she saw no judgment, only a fierce, unwavering belief. He had told her she deserved the son. In that moment, she remembered his words from the fevered night, the precious mistake he would pray to make again. And she remembered her own revelation in the dark. That love, if it saves a soul, is a form of grace. Reverend Carter pointed a trembling finger at her. "And so I ask you now, my daughter, before God and these good people, to renounce your sin, to cast out the devil that has taken root in your heart, and to return to the home and the life that has been chosen for you." This was it, the final command, the end of her rebellion. Every eye was on her. She could feel the collective will of the town, of her father, of her entire past, pushing her to submit. She lifted her head. Her eyes were clear and bright with unshed tears. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "No, Father." A collective gasp went through the church. The Reverend stared, his face turning a blotchy red. "I am not a lost girl," Lila said, her voice growing stronger, resonating in the silent building. "For the first time in my life, I have found my own way. You speak of sin. Is it a sin to want a life of your own choosing? Is it a sin to feel compassion for a man who is wounded, in body and in spirit?" She looked from her father's shocked face to the townspeople. "You see a killer." She turned her gaze to Elias. "I see a man who has known more pain than any of us, and who showed me kindness when no one else would. You call him a serpent. I call him the only person who has ever seen me for who I am, not for who he wanted me to be." She took a step away from the pulpit, a small, symbolic act of separation. "I will not go back to that life. I will not be a possession to be traded for security. I will not live in a cage, no matter how gilded. My place is here." Before her father could unleash the torrent of fury that was building in his face, the church doors burst open. Jedediah Crow stood there, a cruel smile on his face. Flanked by 4 of his men, they held rifles, and their eyes were fixed on Elias. "Sorry to interrupt the sermon, preacher," Jedediah sneered, "but we're here to collect a soul of our own." Panic erupted. The townspeople screamed and scrambled for cover, diving under the pews. Elias was already on his feet, shoving Lila behind him, his hand reaching for the Colt he no longer had. Marshal Wade drew his own pistol. "Crow, this is a house of God. You lay down your arms." Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "God ain't in Silver Creek today. Marshal." He raised his rifle. The first shot came not from the gang, but from Elias. In the confusion, he had lunged for the rifle one of the crows had dropped as he dove for cover. He fired from the hip, the shot going high but buying them a precious second. The church became a maelstrom of noise, smoke, and splintering wood. Wade and Elias fell into a grim rhythm. Using the pews as cover, one was the law, one was an outlaw. But in that moment, they were just two men fighting to protect the innocent. A bullet grazed Wade's arm. A Crow gang member fell, clutching his chest. Elias knew he was the target. He had to draw their fire. To end it, he saw Jedediah reloading near the back, using a pillar for cover. With a ragged breath, Elias broke from the cover of the pew and charged, firing his last two shots. He ran straight into the heart of the fight, a desperate, suicidal gamble. His shots found their mark. Jedediah Crow staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing to the floor. But as he fell, another gang member fired from the side. The bullet hit Elias square in the chest. The impact was like being kicked by a horse. The world dissolved into a silent, spinning vortex of pain. He hit the floor, the rifle clattering from his grasp. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Lila's face, her mouth open in a silent scream. The fight was over in moments. The remaining gang members, their leader dead, lost their nerve and fled. A wounded Wade secured the church as silence fell, thick and heavy, smelling of smoke and blood. Lila didn't hear him. She ran to Elias, falling to her knees beside him on the blood-soaked floorboards. He was dying. She could see it in his eyes, in the shallow, rattling breaths he took. His blood was on her hands, on her dress, on the floor of the house of God. Her father was shouting her name, his voice filled with horror. The townspeople were staring. She saw none of them. She saw only Elias. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the blood and the dust. This could not be the end. She would not let it be. She leaned down, cradling his face in her hands. In the middle of the sacred space, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle, she kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation, of blessing, of a final, defiant claim. His lips were cold. She pulled back and looked up at the cross hanging above the pulpit, her voice a raw, broken prayer that filled the silent church. "Please," she sobbed, her words directed at the heavens, at her father, at anyone who would listen. "Forgive this love. Forgive it, because it saves a soul." He didn't die. The bullet, slowed by a thick leather strap of his satchel, had missed his heart by a fraction of an inch, lodging itself against a rib. The town's self-proclaimed doctor, a whiskey-soaked old prospector who had seen more gunshot wounds than he had gold nuggets, managed to dig it out with a pair of pliers and a prayer. He declared that Elias Boone was too stubborn to die, but survival was only the beginning of the battle. The long night of his fever was replaced by the long, slow day of his recovery. In the aftermath of the church shootout, Silver Creek was a town cleaved in two. One half saw Elias as a hero. He and the marshal had stood their ground, protecting the townsfolk from a notorious gang. These were the miners who had seen his courage, the women who had hidden with their children under the pews. They left pots of broth and clean linen on a stump near the tent, silent offerings of gratitude and respect. Marshal Wade himself was a frequent visitor, his initial suspicion replaced by a gruff, hard-won admiration. He would sit by the fire, talking in low tones about the search for the crows who had escaped, treating Elias not as a suspect, but as a wounded comrade in arms. The other half of the town saw only a sinner. To them, Elias was the lightning rod that had drawn the storm. He was a killer, and his presence had brought blood and terror into their house of God, and Lila, in their eyes, was worse. She was the fallen preacher's daughter who had publicly shamed her father and thrown her lot in with a gunman. They whispered as she walked by, their faces pinched with moral disapproval. She was a scandal, a cautionary tale told to their own daughters. Lila felt the sting of their scorn, but she had no time for it. Her entire world had contracted to the small canvas tent and the man lying within it. She became his shadow, his hands, his strength. She changed his bandages, cleaned the ever-present sweat of pain from his brow, and spoon-fed him when he was too weak to lift his own hand. She learned the geography of his pain, the sharp intake of breath when he moved a certain way, the tightening of his jaw that signaled a fresh wave of agony. In those long, quiet hours, a new kind of intimacy grew between them, forged not in passion, but in the crucible of shared vulnerability. He, who had always been so self-reliant, was forced to depend on her for everything, and she, who had always been so dependent, discovered a deep well of strength she never knew she possessed. Her father did not stay. In the chaotic hours after the gunfight, he had tried once more to command her, to pull her away from the bloody scene. She had simply looked at him, her face streaked with Elias's blood, and said, "My place is here." The finality in her voice had broken him. He saw he was not just fighting a man, he was fighting a fundamental change in his daughter, a change he had no power to reverse. He left the next morning on the early stagecoach. He did not say goodbye, but when Lila returned to the boarding house to gather her few belongings, she found a letter on the pillow of her neatly made bed. The envelope simply said, "Lila May." Her father's handwriting was as severe and controlled as the man himself. Her hand trembled as she opened it. The letter was short, the ink slightly blurred in places, as if by a drop of water or a tear. "My daughter, I came to this wilderness to save your soul. I see now that I did not understand it at all. The laws I have preached are clear and rigid, like walls of stone. But life is not stone. It is a river of dust, and it flows in ways we cannot predict. I see the look in your eyes when you look at that man, and I see the look in his when he looks at you. I called it sin, for I was afraid of it. It is a power I do not comprehend. But I saw him stand to protect you and our town, willing to give his life, and I saw you stand before me, willing to give up your own reputation and safety for him. My righteousness feels like a cold and empty thing next to such conviction. If your love is a sin, I find myself praying that I might have been brave enough to commit such a sin when I was a young man. Perhaps then my heart would not be so barren now. May God have mercy on us all. Father." Lila read the letter 3 times, the stiff paper softening in her hands. The words were not an apology, not a blessing, but they were something far more precious, an admission, a crack in the stone wall of his certainty. For the first time, she did not feel anger or resentment toward her father, only a profound, aching sorrow for his lonely, rigid world. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it away. It was a farewell, and it was a release. She was truly on her own now. As the weeks turned into a month, a subtle shift occurred in Silver Creek. A miner's son came down with a lung fever, and Lila, remembering an herbal remedy her mother used to make, brewed a pungent tea that helped ease his breathing. A young woman working in the saloon burned her arm badly, and Lila, her hands now steady and sure from tending to Elias, cleaned and dressed the wound with a calm competence that surprised them both. People began to see her differently. She was no longer just the preacher's daughter or the gunman's woman. She was Lila, the one you went to when you were hurt. She had found her purpose, not in a church, but in the quiet, humble work of healing. Elias, too, was healing. The color returned to his face, and the hardness to his muscles. He began to walk, first with a limp, then with his old, steady stride. He and Marshal Wade spent hours poring over maps, tracking the movements of the remaining crows. The bounty hunter's knowledge of the territory and the outlaw mind was invaluable. A strange partnership was formed, built on the shared ground of the church floor. Elias was no longer just an outsider. He was becoming a part of the town's defense. The tent, however, remained a problem. It had been a refuge, but as the days grew colder, it was no longer enough. They were living in a state of limbo, in a temporary shelter that reflected their uncertain future. One evening, Marshal Wade stopped by the fire. "There's an old cabin, west end of the arroyo," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Belonged to a prospector named Silas, who caught gold fever and headed for the mountains a year back. Never came back. The town's got no claim on it. It's just sitting there. Roof is solid." The next day, Elias and Lila walked to see it. It was little more than a one-room shack, built of rough-hewn timber and mud chinking, but it had a stone foundation and a solid-looking door. It was abandoned and neglected, but it was real. It was a home. They spent the next week making it their own. Elias, his strength returning, patched the roof and replaced a broken window pane. Lila scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed and whitewashed the interior walls, making the small space feel bright and clean. Some of the townspeople, the ones on their side of the divide, helped. A miner's wife brought them a spare mattress stuffed with fresh straw. The blacksmith forged them a new set of hinges for the door. They were building more than a house. They were weaving themselves into the fabric of the community. On the day they moved their few belongings from the tent into the cabin, a sense of profound peace settled over Lila. She stood in the doorway, watching Elias stack firewood against the outside wall. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light over the landscape. This small, humble cabin on the edge of a harsh, unforgiving town was the first place that had ever felt truly like home. That night, they sat before their own hearth, the fire casting a warm, dancing glow on the walls. The long night of their trial was over. Elias was still quiet, still a man who held his secrets and his pain close, but the haunted look in his eyes had softened. He looked at her across the small space, a look of deep, unspoken gratitude. "The tent," Lila said softly. More to herself than to him, it felt like such a terrible mistake. That night, Elias reached across the space between them and took her hand. His touch was warm and sure. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It was the beginning." The tent had been a place of error, a shelter stumbled into by accident. But this small cabin, this house, was different. It was a choice. It was a place built of intention, a foundation of stone where two broken people were starting to build something whole. The wrong tent had led them, through a river of dust and blood, to the right home. The sound that defined the new Silver Creek was the train. 3 years had passed, and the whistle of the locomotive, arriving twice a week from the east, had replaced the lonely howl of the wind as the town's dominant voice. It was a sound of connection, of progress, of a world growing smaller. With the railroad came money, families, and a sturdier brand of law. The dusty main street was now graded and wide, lined with 2-story wooden buildings that boasted false fronts and glass windows. The tents and lean-tos had mostly vanished, retreating to the fringes like a forgotten memory of a wilder, harder time. The town was still raw and sun-beaten, but it was no longer a temporary camp. It was putting down roots. So were Elias and Lila. Their small cabin was no longer isolated. A few other homes had sprung up in the arroyo, forming a small, quiet neighborhood. A porch had been added to the front, and in the mornings, Lila would sit there with her coffee, watching the sun crest the distant mesas. But this morning, she was not on the porch. She was standing before a dozen children in a new building that smelled of fresh sawn pine and chalk dust, the Silver Creek School. It had a real bell, a cast-iron potbelly stove for the winter, and 6 benches that Elias had built himself. Lila stood at the front, a piece of chalk in her hand, her dark hair pinned neatly in a bun. The fearful, exhausted girl who had stumbled into a stranger's tent was gone. In her place was a woman of quiet confidence and boundless patience. She was teaching the children their letters, her voice a calm and steady presence in the room filled with shuffling feet and occasional whispers. "The letter H," she said, drawing it on the slate board, "is for home and for hope." A small girl with bright red pigtails raised her hand. "Yes, Sarah. Is it for happy, too?" Miss Carter, the girl asked. Lila smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up her face. "Yes, Sarah, it is for happy, too." She found her happiness here, in the simple, profound act of opening up the world to these children of miners and merchants. It was a purpose she had forged for herself, a life built not from duty or defiance, but from a quiet, internal calling. She was no longer running from a cage. She was building a foundation. While Lila was shaping the town's future, Elias was tending to its past. He was not at the cabin, but further out, near the deep, stone-lined well that marked the spot where they had once hidden from the storm. The area had been a barren patch of rock and scrub. Now, a dozen small, tender saplings stood in carefully dug, watered holes, cottonwoods. They were little more than twigs, vulnerable to the wind and the sun, but they were alive. He worked with a patient, methodical rhythm that was new to him. The hands that had been trained to the cold, efficient mechanics of a firearm now moved with the gentle precision of a gardener. He hauled buckets of water from the well, his movement slow and deliberate, favoring the side where the bullet had torn through him. The wound had long since healed, but it had left a permanent, deep ache, a constant reminder of the price of his peace. The ghosts were quieter now. They no longer screamed at him in the dead of night. The memory of Jacob, the friend he'd been forced to execute, was still there. But it was a scar now, not an open wound. He had found, in the quiet labor of nurturing life, a kind of penance. For every man he had put in the ground, he would raise a tree to the sky. It was not a balance, not a repayment, but it was a start. It was an act of hope. He was finishing with the last tree when he saw the rider approaching. He wasn't a local. The man rode an expensive-looking bay and wore a clean duster and a city hat. He looked like a journalist or a land speculator, one of the many new types the railroad had brought. Elias straightened up, his hand not going to his gun, but simply resting on his hip. He was wary, but no longer constantly afraid. The stranger reined in his horse a few feet away, taking in the scene the rough-faced man with the faded scars, the improbable sight of young trees being planted in the hard desert soil. "Good morning," the man said, his voice educated, with an Eastern accent. "Quite a task you've set for yourself here." Elias nodded, not offering any encouragement. "The land is thirsty." "Indeed." The stranger dismounted, his curiosity piqued. "Forgive my forwardness, but you are Elias Boone, aren't you?" "I am," Elias said, his expression unreadable. "I thought so. My name is Theodore Finch. I'm a writer, collecting stories of the West, the real stories, not the dime novel fantasies. Your name, and that of Miss Carter, it's become something of a local legend in Silver Creek." Elias said nothing, his silence a clear discouragement. Finch was undeterred. "They say you single-handedly fought off the Crow gang in the church. They say Miss Carter, a preacher's daughter, stood up to her own father for you. It's a remarkable tale of courage and, well, of love." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They also say that this remarkable story of yours, it all began with a simple mistake. A young lady, lost in a storm, entering the wrong tent." He smiled. "A man who thought he was being charming. Is there any truth to that particular detail?" Elias looked away from the writer, his gaze drifting toward the town, toward the small schoolhouse where he knew Lila was. He thought of that night, the terror in her eyes, the weight of the gun in his hand. He thought of the long, bloody road that had led from that moment to this one, standing here under a peaceful blue sky, his hands covered in honest dirt. A mistake. It was such a small word for an event that had utterly remade his world. He turned his pale, steady eyes back to the writer. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "There's no mistake," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "If it teaches you how to love the right way." The writer was taken aback by the simple profundity of the answer. He fumbled for a notebook, but the moment was gone. Elias had turned back to his work, his message delivered. Finch, feeling he had intruded on something private and profound, tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, his head full of a story far deeper than the one he had come looking for. Elias finished his work as the sun reached its zenith. He gathered his tools and walked back toward the cabin, his long shadow stretching out before him. As he neared the arroyo, he saw Lila walking to meet him, a small basket in her hand. The children had been dismissed for the day. She met him by a large barrel cactus that stood like a silent sentinel near their path. It was an old cactus, its green, pleated skin scarred by the years, a survivor of droughts, storms, and the relentless sun. "The writer found you," she said. It wasn't a question. "He did," Elias confirmed. "He was collecting stories." "What did you tell him?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his face. "The truth." He reached out and brushed a stray piece of dust from her cheek. "That our story isn't about a mistake." She leaned into his touch, a silent affirmation. They stood there for a moment in the comfortable quiet that had grown between them, the silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand each other. As she shifted her gaze, she saw it. On the sunny side of the old, scarred cactus, a single, perfect bud was pushing its way out. It was a tight knot of vibrant magenta, a promise of a flower, startling in its beauty against the harsh, spiny green. It was the first bloom of the spring. It was a sign of hope, not in a gentle, manicured garden, but here, in the heart of the unforgiving landscape they had both come to call home. Their love was like that flower, a tough, resilient, beautiful thing that had found a way to bloom in the most unlikely of places. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. And so the years, like the desert wind, passed over Silver Creek, smoothing the sharp edges of the land and the people who lived on it. The town grew, its stories becoming history, its history becoming legend. And at the heart of the town's founding myth were two figures who had become as much a part of the landscape as the mesas that watched over them. Elias and Lila Boone. They had married a year after the church shootout, in a quiet ceremony officiated by a traveling judge, with Marshall Wade as their witness. Their life was not a grand adventure, but a quiet tapestry woven from small, ordinary moments of grace. Decades passed. The railroad brought the world to their doorstep, and then the world, in its hurry, built new tracks that bypassed their town, leaving Silver Creek to settle back into a peaceful, sun-drenched slumber. Marshall Wade was laid to rest in the town cemetery, his name carved on a stone that declared him a good and honest man. The saloons grew quieter, the mines played out. The children Lila had taught grew up and had children of their own, raising them on the story of the gunman and the preacher's daughter. Elias and Lila grew old. The cabin that had been their refuge became their fortress against the encroachments of time. The cottonwoods Elias had planted as saplings were now mighty trees, their leaves a canopy of rustling green that offered shade and the music of the wind. His hair was a shock of white, and the lines on his face told the story of 1,000 suns. But the faded blue of his eyes, when they rested on Lila, was as clear and steady as it had ever been. Lila's hair was the color of spun silver, and her hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, were still the gentle, healing hands that had tended to a wounded town. They spent their evenings on the porch Elias had built, sitting in 2 sturdy rocking chairs, watching the desert perform its daily miracle of sunset. They didn't speak much anymore. They didn't have to. Theirs was a communion that existed beyond words, a shared silence that was more intimate than any conversation. They had lived an entire lifetime together, and its joys and sorrows were a landscape they both knew by heart. One warm afternoon, as they sat on the porch, a young girl came walking up the path. She was perhaps 10 years old, with her grandmother's bright red hair and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She was Sarah's granddaughter, and she often came to bring them a loaf of fresh bread or to listen to Lila's stories. She came and stood before the porch steps, clutching a small bouquet of desert marigolds. "These are for you, Miss Lila," the girl said, holding them out. "Why, thank you, Emily," Lila said, her voice a soft, gentle rasp. She took the flowers, her gnarled fingers brushing the child's smooth ones. Elias smiled, a quiet, contented expression. He loved to see Lila with the children. He saw in their innocent faces the world of hope and goodness she had fought so hard to build. The girl, Emily, lingered, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She had a question in her eyes, one she had clearly been saving up for a special occasion. "Miss Lila," she began, her voice shy. "Yes, child. My grandma tells me stories about you and Mr. Boone, about how the town started." She took a breath, summoning her courage. "Is it true? Is the story real? Did you really get lost in a sandstorm and go into the wrong tent by mistake?" The question, so direct, so innocent, hung in the warm, still air. It was the heart of the legend, the single accidental spark that had started the fire. Lila looked away from the child, her gaze moving to Elias. He was already looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw the entire journey reflected the flickering lantern light, the terror and the blood, the quiet dawns and the peaceful dusks, the long, hard, beautiful years, all of it, born from that one single moment of error. A slow smile spread across her wrinkled face, a smile that seemed to smooth away the years. She turned back to the little girl, her eyes full of a gentle, profound wisdom. "Yes, dear, it's true," she said, her voice soft as a whisper on the wind. "And that's how I found my way home." The child, satisfied with the answer, though not fully understanding its depth, beamed. She said her goodbyes and ran back down the path, her red pigtails bouncing, leaving the old couple alone once more with the silence and the setting sun. Elias reached over and took Lila's hand. His grip was still strong, still the hand that had held a gun, that had planted a tree, that had held her through fever and fear. She laced her fingers through his, and they sat there, watching as the sky bled from orange to purple over the mountains. The evening wind began to stir, a cool breath against the lingering heat of the day. It whispered through the leaves of the cottonwoods, a sound like a gentle river. It was the same wind that had once howled with a devil's voice, that had scoured the land and driven a lost girl to a stranger's tent. But now, its voice was different. It was no longer a scream of loneliness, but a song of peace. It blew over the quiet town of Silver Creek, over the schoolhouse and the church. It rustled the grass in the cemetery, a soft caress over the names of the dead. It carried the scent of dust and rain and the faint, sweet perfume of the cactus flowers that still bloomed, stubbornly and beautifully, every spring. The land was still harsh, still a place that demanded strength and resilience. But it was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of a love that had been strong enough to redeem it. True love, the wind seemed to whisper, is not found in the avoidance of mistakes, but in the courage to transform them into a life worth living. It is the tenacious flower that blooms in the driest soil, the sturdy tree that grows from a wounded landscape. It is the long, quiet road that begins in a stranger's tent and ends. Finally, at home, the wind, which had witnessed the bloodshed and the hatred, the sin and the judgment, now carried a different story, a legend of redemption. It blew over the porch where two old lovers sat hand in hand, and then it moved on, carrying its gentle benediction out across the vast, sleeping desert, to the place where all winds finally come to rest. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you're listening from in the comments to connect with each other. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Night Away, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.